My son called, "Mom, I'm getting married tomorrow. I sold your house for $800,000. I need the money more than you and my wife." Bye. I just laughed. He didn't know that the house was actually, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway, and I have lived in the same white-framed house on Birchwood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina, for 41 years. I raised my children there. I buried my husband there. Not literally, of course, but the grief of losing Harold settled into those walls the way morning light settles into old curtains. Slow, permanent, and somehow still beautiful. The house was mine. Every creak of the porch, every stubborn drawer in the kitchen, every rose bush I'd planted along the fence with my own 67-year-old hands. Mine. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because what happened only makes sense if you understand what that house meant to me. I had 2 children. My daughter Patricia lived in Denver and called every Sunday without fail. She was steady, sensible, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and kept her promises. Then there was my son, Marcus. Marcus was the one I'd worried about since he was 17 and convinced the rules of the world simply didn't apply to him. He was charming in the way that certain dangerous things are charming. The way a summer storm looks beautiful right before it destroys your garden. I loved him. Of course I loved him. But loving Marcus always required a certain vigilance. He'd drifted in and out of my life over the years, appearing when he needed money or a place to stay, disappearing when things were going well for him. After Harold died 5 years ago, Marcus came around more frequently. At first I thought it was grief bringing him home. I told myself he was growing up finally, at 42. But looking back now, I can see the signs I chose not to read. It started small. He asked casually, over dinner one Thanksgiving, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing. I was 70 years old and in perfectly good health. I told him so. He smiled and changed the subject. Then, the following spring, he brought a woman to Sunday dinner. Her name was Renee. She was 34, polished in the way of someone who has practiced being polished, with a smile that arrived slightly before her eyes did. She complimented my kitchen and asked with great sweetness how many square feet the house was. I told her I didn't remember exactly. She nodded as if I'd confirmed something. The questions continued over the following months. Marcus asked if I'd updated my will. He asked whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor. He asked once while standing in the backyard looking at the property line whether the lot extended all the way to the oak tree. He knew it did. He'd climbed that oak tree as a boy. He was mapping something, I realized later. He was calculating. I told myself I was being paranoid. This is what we do with the people we love. We give them the benefit of every possible doubt, long past the point where doubt is reasonable. I kept cooking Sunday dinners. I kept answering his calls. I told myself Marcus was simply curious, simply planning, simply being the attentive son he had never quite managed to be before. And then came the Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and a half-finished crossword puzzle when my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice was bright. Too bright. The way voices get when a person has rehearsed what they're about to say. "Mom," he said, "I've got some big news. Renee and I are getting married. Tomorrow, actually. Small ceremony, just us." I said congratulations and meant it, despite everything. Then came the pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it. "There's something else," he said. "I needed capital to get our life started, and I found a buyer for the house. I signed the papers last week, got $800,000 for it. The closing is in 30 days. You'll need to start thinking about where you want to go next." I sat very still. The crossword puzzle blurred in front of me. "Marcus," I said slowly, "what do you mean you signed papers?" "It's done, Mom. The real estate attorney handled everything. I have power of attorney. You signed it 2 years ago when you had that knee surgery and needed someone to manage things temporarily. I used it. The money's going into mine and Renee's joint account. I've already got plans for it. You'll be fine. You can rent something smaller. He said a few more things. I don't remember all of them. What I remember is that I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat there, in the kitchen of my house, with my coffee growing cold, and I laughed. A short, quiet laugh. The kind that comes not from amusement, but from the sudden, crystalline clarity of finally understanding something you should have understood long ago. Because Marcus, for all his scheming, did not know one very important thing about that house, and that one thing was going to change everything. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. The October light came through the window the way it always did at that hour, golden, unhurried, falling across the linoleum floor in the same pattern it had fallen for 4 decades. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went silent. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, and yet I felt as though I had stepped through some invisible door into a different world entirely. Let me tell you what fear feels like at 70 years old when you have just been told your home has been sold out from under you. It isn't the sharp electric fear of youth. It's slower. It settles into your chest like cold water, and for a moment you cannot breathe, cannot think, can only sit with the weight of it pressing down. I thought of the rose bushes. I thought of the bedroom where Harold and I had slept for 36 years, the particular way the mattress had conformed to the shape of us over time. I thought of the photographs on the hallway wall, Patricia's gap-toothed kindergarten smile, Marcus in his Little League uniform, Harold and me on our wedding day, young and laughing and entirely ignorant of all the years still ahead of us. And then I thought, no, not a dramatic no, not a no shouted at the ceiling, just a quiet, interior no. The kind that comes from somewhere very deep and very certain. The kind that doesn't waver. I got up, washed my coffee cup, and sat back down with a legal pad and a pen. The first thing I needed to understand was the legal reality. Yes, I had signed a power of attorney 2 years ago, during the week after my knee replacement surgery, when I'd been on pain medication and genuinely unable to manage my own affairs for a short period. My attorney at the time, a kind older man named Robert Finch, had drawn it up as a limited, temporary document. The key word was limited. I remembered that clearly because Robert had explained it to me carefully. The document authorized Marcus to handle specific medical and financial decisions during my incapacitation, paying bills, communicating with my insurance company, making medical decisions if I was unconscious. It was not, and I was fairly certain of this, a general durable power of attorney that would allow him to sell real property. This was the thing Marcus didn't know. I remembered exactly what I had signed. I also knew something else he didn't know, something about the house itself. But I wasn't ready to think about that yet. First, I needed to be sure of my legal ground. I picked up the phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, and I told her everything, calmly and in order, the way Harold had always said I told stories. Like a woman who has already decided how it ends. Patricia was quiet through most of it. When I finished, she said, "Mom, that is fraud." Not hysterically, just clearly, like her mother's daughter. "I believe it may be," I said, "but I need to be certain before I do anything." "You need an attorney, not Robert Finch, and he's retired. You need someone who does real estate litigation." She was right. I wrote down, find attorney, real estate, elder law. The next morning, I did not call Marcus back. I had nothing to say to him yet, And more importantly, I did not want him to know I was moving. One of the few advantages I had in this situation was that Marcus believed I was shocked into paralysis. He expected tears, pleas, perhaps a resigned phone call asking where I should start looking for apartments. He did not expect his 70-year-old mother to be sitting at her kitchen table with a legal pad, building a case. I called 3 attorneys that morning, found through the North Carolina State Bar's referral service. The second one I spoke with was a woman named Sandra Okafor, a real estate and elder law attorney based in Asheville. Her assistant fit me in for a consultation the following afternoon. I wrote her name down and underlined it twice. Then I went to my filing cabinet, the old green metal one in the spare bedroom that Marcus had always made fun of, calling it relics from the paper age, and I began to pull documents. The original deed to the house, Harold's death certificate, the power of attorney I'd signed 2 years ago, my will, the title insurance documents from when Harold and I had purchased the property in 1983. And at the very bottom of the third drawer, in a manila envelope labeled in Harold's handwriting, "Important, Dorothy, keep safe," I found the document that made me sit down slowly on the edge of the spare bed and close my eyes for a moment. It was a deed restriction Harold had quietly added to the property title in 1991, the year Marcus had gotten into serious trouble at 18, and Harold had said to me, very quietly, over the kitchen table one night, "I don't want the boy to ever be able to touch this house, Dorothy. No matter what." I had forgotten about it. 30 years is a long time, and grief does things to memory. But Harold, careful, methodical Harold, had not forgotten. He had added a deed restriction specifying that the property could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered without the written, notarized consent of Dorothy May Calloway, regardless of any power of attorney or other legal instrument. Marcus had sold a house he could not legally sell. I put the document back in the envelope, held it in both hands for a moment, and whispered, "Thank you, Harold." Then I picked up my pen and started writing the plan. Sandra Okafor's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Lexington Avenue, above a coffee shop that smelled of dark roast and cinnamon. I arrived 10 minutes early, sat in the waiting area with my manila envelope on my lap, and watched the afternoon traffic move slowly below the window. I had dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but because dressing carefully was something I did when I needed to feel like myself. Gray slacks, a blue cardigan, Harold's watch on my wrist, which I wore on days when I needed steadiness. Sandra Okafor was perhaps 50, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of professional calm that comes from having sat across from a great many people in crisis. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. I did not editorialize or embellish. I laid the documents on her desk in order: the deed, the power of attorney, the deed restriction, the title documents. She read them carefully, with no expression I could interpret, and then she set them down and looked at me. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "the deed restriction your late husband filed is recorded with the county. It's part of the public title record. Any competent real estate attorney conducting a title search before a sale would have found it." She paused. "Which means either the buyer's attorney didn't conduct a proper title search, which is negligence on their part, or someone concealed its existence." Another pause. "Or the sale hasn't actually closed yet, and the title company simply hasn't flagged it." "Marcus said closing was in 30 days, I said. "Then there is time." She picked up her pen. "Here is what we're going to do." The first step, she explained, was a title search, pulling the current public record to understand exactly what Marcus had filed and with whom. The second step was a letter to the escrow company holding the transaction. formally notifying them of the deed restriction and placing the sale in dispute. The third step, if necessary, was a filing with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds to formally contest the transfer. "What about the power of attorney?" I asked. Sandra looked at the document again. "This is a limited POA, medical and financial management during incapacitation. It explicitly does not include real property transactions. See this language here." She pointed. "Whoever advised your son that this authorized a property sale either misread the document or misled him. Either way, the sale, as structured, is void on two independent grounds: the restricted deed and the scope of the POA." I nodded slowly. "And if Marcus pushes back, then we pursue it in court?" She said it the way you might say, "Then we order dessert." Evenly. "But I don't think it will get that far once we put the escrow company on notice. They will not proceed with a contested title. The buyer will walk, or the sale will be unwound." I signed a retainer agreement that afternoon. That evening, I received a text from Marcus. "Mom, hope you're starting to look at places. Buyer wants possession in 28 days." Reading it, I felt a strange, cool sensation. Not quite anger, not quite satisfaction, but something between the two. He still thought he had won. He was still playing the game as if I were the piece he was moving, not the player at the other side of the board. I did not respond. 2 days later, Sandra called me with the results of the title search. "It's there," she said. "Clear as day. The deed restriction is recorded and valid. And here's what's interesting. There's a notation in the escrow file indicating that Marcus's real estate agent was asked about encumbrances on the property and stated there were none." She let that sit for a moment. "That's a false statement to an escrow company in the course of a real estate transaction. In North Carolina, that's potentially wire fraud." I sat down in my kitchen chair. "So he lied. Someone did." Her voice was careful. "I've sent the formal dispute notice to the escrow company. I've also copied the buyer's attorney. The transaction is now legally clouded. It will not close." I held the phone for a moment after she finished speaking. Outside, the rose bushes I'd planted 10 years ago were still holding their last October blooms. Small, stubborn, the deep red ones Harold had always loved. The house was quiet around me. This was the moment I understood. There was no going back now. Marcus would find out about the legal challenge within days, perhaps hours. He would know I had gone to an attorney. He would know I was fighting. And Marcus, when cornered, had never in his life responded with grace. I was not afraid of what was coming, but I was clear-eyed about it. I called Patricia that night and told her what Sandra had found. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Mom, he actually thought he could do this." "Yes," I said. "What does he think you are?" I considered that question for a moment. Really considered it, the way you consider questions that have more than one honest answer. Then I said, "He thinks I'm an old woman who loves him too much to fight back." Patricia said nothing for a second. Then, "He doesn't know you very well?" "No," I agreed, "he doesn't." The call from Marcus came 3 days later, on a Friday morning, while I was deadheading the last of the rose bushes along the front fence. I heard the phone ring inside, recognized his number on the screen when I came in, and answered with the same steady voice I would use to answer any call. "What did you do?" His voice was not bright this time. The rehearsed warmth was entirely gone. "Good morning, Marcus," I said. "I got a call from the escrow company. They said the sale is in dispute. They're saying there's a restriction on the deed. My attorney says it could invalidate the whole transaction." His voice was controlled, but I could hear something moving underneath it, like water under thin ice. "What is this, Mom?" "That's a deed restriction your father filed in 1991, I said. It requires my written, notarized consent to transfer the property. I didn't give that consent. The sale cannot proceed. Silence. You went behind my back, he said finally. I hired an attorney, I said. That's not behind your back. That's in front of it. The thin ice cracked. His voice shifted. Not to grief, not to remorse, but to a cold, calculated hardness that I recognized from his teenage years, from every moment in his life when he had been caught doing something he knew was wrong and decided to meet it with aggression rather than accountability. You don't understand what you're doing, he said. The buyer has already committed resources to this. I have an agreement. If you blow this up, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences, Marcus? A pause. Renee's brother is an attorney, a litigator. If you think you can use some dusty old document to embarrass me and walk away clean, you're wrong. We'll challenge that restriction. We'll argue Dad wasn't in his right mind when he filed it. We'll argue undue influence. We'll argue Harold was in perfect health in 1991, I said. The filing is clean and properly recorded. Your attorney will tell you the same thing mine told me. I'm warning you, Mom. The word Mom had a strange quality in his mouth now. Not affectionate, not even neutral, but vaguely contemptuous. Don't do this. I stood in my kitchen, Harold's watch on my wrist, the manila envelope in its drawer, and I said, I already have. He hung up. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment, breathing. My hands were steady. I want to be honest with you. There was a part of me that ached. Not for the Marcus who had just threatened me on the phone, but for the boy who had once climbed the oak tree in the backyard and called down to me that he could see all the way to the mountains. That boy and this man were not the same person, and I had been slow to accept that. But I accepted it now. The next move came not from Marcus but from Renee. She arrived at my door the following afternoon, unannounced, which was itself a kind of message. She was dressed beautifully, as always, and she brought flowers. Yellow tulips, which struck me as a calculated choice, cheerful and unthreatening. She asked if she could come in. I let her because I wanted to hear what she had to say. She sat at my kitchen table and told me, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound both reasonable and sad, that Marcus was under a lot of pressure, that they had made financial commitments based on the expected proceeds, that she hoped we could find a way to resolve this as a family. She said the words as a family twice. She touched my hand once, briefly, and then, when I said nothing except to ask her to please remove her hand, something shifted in her face. The calibrated sadness dropped away. What replaced it was something flatter and harder. Dorothy, she said, and the use of my first name was another small act of aggression. We will go to court. We will contest the restriction. We will make the case that Harold was not competent, and even if we lose, we will drag this out for 2 years. Do you really want to spend the last years of your life in litigation? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stood up, picked up the tulips from where she'd set them on the counter, walked to the front door, and opened it. Renee, I said, I'm going to ask you to leave my house. Her jaw tightened. She stood. She walked to the door with the particular stiff dignity of someone who expected a different outcome. On the porch, she turned back and looked at me with something I can only describe as a cold assessment, as though she was recalculating. This isn't over, she said. I know, I said, and closed the door. Sandra filed the formal deed restriction defense with the county that afternoon. The buyer, having been informed by their own attorney that the title was fatally clouded, formally withdrew from the transaction 3 days later. The sale was dead. Marcus sent me a text that evening that I will not reproduce here because some words, once read, take a long time to forget. Patricia called that night, and I told her everything. She was on a flight from Denver the next morning. I spent the following 4 days doing very little. I sat on my porch in the afternoons. I worked in the garden. I read a novel I'd been meaning to read for a year. I let Patricia cook for me and argue with Marcus on the phone so I didn't have to. I slept 8 hours each night, which I had not managed in weeks. The threat was not gone. I knew that. But I had established my ground, and the ground was solid, and sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply rest in the knowledge of that. On the 5th day, when Patricia had gone back to Denver with reluctance and a long list of emergency contacts she'd saved in my phone, Marcus tried a different approach. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, not in the aggressive voice of the previous week, but in the old voice, the one I recognized from his childhood, warm and slightly plaintive, the voice he used when he wanted something and had decided charm was the better instrument. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been under enormous stress. He said Renee had pushed him further than he was comfortable going, and that if there was any way we could sit down and talk about this like adults, he would really appreciate that. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Marcus, I love you. I will always love you. And I need you to understand that those two things, my love for you and my defense of this house, are not in conflict. I am not punishing you. I am protecting something that belongs to me, that your father worked for, that I have lived in for 41 years. No amount of conversation is going to change that." A pause. "So you won't even talk to me?" "I will always talk to you," I said. "But if talking means considering handing over my home, then no, that conversation isn't possible." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, Mom." Not angry. Something harder than anger. A withdrawal. A door closing. "Okay." He hung up, and I sat with the silence, and I noticed that my hands were entirely still in my lap. Over the following days, I became aware that Marcus and Renee had not entirely disappeared. My neighbor Connie, who lived 2 doors down and had known me since Patricia was in grade school, mentioned that she'd seen a car parked across the street for several hours one afternoon. A silver sedan she didn't recognize. She mentioned it casually, as neighbors do, but we both understood what it meant. They were watching, waiting to see if I would crack, if the pressure of the past 2 weeks would ultimately wear me down into compliance. It would not. But I will admit that knowing I was being observed was unsettling in a particular way. Not because I had anything to hide, but because it was a reminder that this was not over, that Marcus's retreat was strategic rather than genuine. I decided, that week, that I needed to stop carrying this alone. I had a small circle of friends in Asheville. Women I'd known for years. Women who had weathered their own varieties of difficulty and loss. There was Connie, of course. There was my friend Margot, who had raised 3 children alone after her husband left, and who had consequently developed a pragmatic toughness I had always admired. There was Judith, a retired social worker who knew more about family dysfunction and legal protections for older adults than anyone I'd ever met. I invited them to dinner on a Thursday night. I cooked the pot roast Harold's mother had taught me, the one that required 3 hours and wasn't worth cutting short. I set the table properly, the good china, the cloth napkins, the candles. When they arrived and we had eaten, and the wine was open, and the evening had settled into the easy warmth that long friendships produce, I told them everything. They did not interrupt. They did not offer false comfort. When I finished, Margot put down her glass and said, "Dot, I always thought that boy was headed somewhere difficult. She said it without cruelty, simply as a statement of fact. Judith leaned forward. Do you know about the Adult Protective Services reporting mechanism? Not that you need it now, but if Marcus tries to reclassify this as a competency matter, which Renee seemed to hint at, there are preemptive things you can document. Connie said, I will personally call the police if I see that silver car again. I laughed. Really laughed. The first time in weeks that laughter came from something that felt like joy rather than irony. These women knew me. They had watched me grieve Harold. They had brought me food in the months after the funeral when I sometimes forgot to cook. They understood that what was at stake was not just a property value, but a life, a history, a self. After they left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, less alone. The case was in Sandra's capable hands. Patricia called every evening. And now Connie, Margot, and Judith knew, which meant that whatever Marcus planned next, he would not be doing it in the shadows. I dried my hands on the dish towel and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the oak tree standing dark against the evening sky. I've got people, Harold, I said quietly. Don't worry. They came on a Sunday. I was returning from church. Something I had done every Sunday of my adult life, a habit so deep it had long since passed beyond habit into something closer to identity. When I saw Marcus's car in my driveway. He was standing by it, and Renee was beside him, and they were both dressed in a way that I recognized as deliberate. Marcus in the blue sweater I'd given him 3 Christmases ago. Renee in something modest and unremarkable. We come in peace. That was the message the clothing was meant to send. I pulled into the garage, sat in the car for a moment, and said a short prayer. Not for patience exactly, more for clarity. When I came out, Marcus said, Mom, we'd really like to talk, if that's all right. I looked at them both for a moment. Then I said, Come inside, I'll make coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had taken Marcus's phone call, where I had written my plans, where I had eaten dinner with my friends the previous week. The table had been the site of so many things in this house. Renee kept her hands folded in her lap and maintained a soft, regretful expression that I suspected had required some practice. I set 3 mugs on the table and let the silence sit for a moment before anyone spoke. There was something instructive about that silence. It revealed who was uncomfortable with it and who wasn't. Renee shifted slightly. Marcus cleared his throat. I poured the coffee. Marcus began. He said that he had spoken to his attorney and understood now that the deed restriction was probably valid. He said he was not planning to contest it, that the litigation path had been Renee's idea more than his, which I noticed Renee did not contradict. He said that he was deeply sorry for the distress he had caused me, that he loved me, and that he hoped we could put this behind us. I said nothing. I sipped my coffee. Then Renee spoke. She said softly that she hoped I understood they had only been trying to secure their future, that they wanted children, that the cost of living was impossible for young people today. She said she felt terrible about how things had escalated. And then, sliding it in as smooth as glass under a door, she said, We wondered if maybe there was a way we could work something out together. The house is large, and you're here alone. And if you were ever to consider a co-ownership arrangement, you'd stay, of course. We'd all live here, and Marcus and I could help with the upkeep. I set down my coffee cup. No, I said. Renee continued as though I hadn't spoken. Just think about it. You'd have company, you'd have help with the house, and we'd all... Renee, I said. I said no. This house is not available for co-ownership. It is not available for sale. It is not available for any arrangement that places you or Marcus on the title. This conversation has an endpoint. and we've reached it." The soft expression left Renee's face as completely as a light going out. What replaced it was something sharp and unguarded, real, finally, and directed at me with the specificity of someone who has decided to stop pretending. "Do you understand," she said, her voice very controlled, "that Marcus is your son? That you're choosing a house over your own child?" "I'm choosing myself," I said. Marcus said in a low voice. "Mom, you're being cruel." And there it was. The final instrument in the toolkit, after charm had failed and intimidation had failed, and manufactured reconciliation had failed. Cruelty. The suggestion that a woman defending her own home, her own life, her own 41 years of history, was the one doing harm. I had expected it, somewhere in the back of my mind, because I had watched Marcus operate this way his entire life. When all else failed, make the other person feel guilty for having boundaries at all. It was an old trick, and I was no longer young enough to fall for it. I stood up. "I think you should go," I said. "Both of you." They left. Marcus's last look at me from the door was not angry. It was something colder than anger, the look of someone filing something away for later use. Renee did not look back at all. I heard their car back out of the driveway, and then the street was quiet again, and the house settled around me the way it always did. Steadily, without drama, like an old friend who simply stays. I locked the door. I stood in my hallway with my back against the wood for a moment, and I will not pretend that I felt nothing. I felt something, a cold, slipping sensation in my chest. Not quite fear, but adjacent to it. The fear of what Marcus's cold look might mean. The fear of how far he might take this. The fear that I was still, after all of this, not entirely safe. I thought about that silver sedan Connie had mentioned, parked across the street for hours. I thought about Desmond, the litigator brother-in-law, and what resources he might still be willing to bring to bear. I thought about the particular vulnerability of being 70 years old and alone in a house that someone else wanted. But here is what I have learned about fear. It is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a signal, a reminder that something matters enough to protect. I felt the fear, and I felt, underneath it, the same steady no that had come to me in the first moments after his phone call. The house was mine. Harold's restriction was recorded. Sandra was one call away. Patricia knew everything. I was afraid, and I was not backing down. In the end, it was not my plan that brought Marcus and Renee to their decisive unraveling. It was their own. Sandra had been quietly thorough in the 2 months since the sale had been blocked. Beyond the deed restriction defense, she had been building a secondary file, gathering documentation around the false statement to the escrow company, the misuse of the limited power of attorney, and a third element I hadn't anticipated. It appeared that Renee's brother, the litigator she had mentioned during her first visit to my home, had drafted several letters to Sandra on Marcus and Renee's behalf, containing statements about the power of attorney's scope that were demonstrably incorrect. Whether this was incompetence or deliberate misrepresentation was, Sandra said, something that the North Carolina State Bar might have an interest in. Sandra had not moved forward on any of this without my instruction. She simply assembled it, organized it, and one afternoon in late November presented it to me across her desk in a neat folder. "You have options," she said. "You can let the blocked sale stand as your victory and walk away, or you can use this to ensure they never try this again." I looked at the folder for a long moment. What does "ensure they never try again" look like? She told me, and I said yes. The mediation session was Sandra's idea. A formal, structured meeting with Marcus, Renee, and Renee's brother, Desmond. who was, in fact, an attorney, though his specialty was personal injury rather than real estate, which explained several things. It was framed in the letter Sandra sent as an opportunity to resolve outstanding disputes related to the Birchwood Lane property and associated legal matters before any further action was taken. Marcus, Desmond's advice notwithstanding, agreed to attend. I suspected this was because he still believed there was something to negotiate, that I had agreed to mediation as a form of capitulation, a prelude to some compromise he intended to walk away with. How many times in his life had that assumption served him? How many people before me had looked at his charm and his confidence and decided the path of least resistance was simply to give him what he wanted? The mediation room was in Sandra's office building, smaller than her main office, with a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window overlooking the street. Sandra sat beside me. Across the table were Marcus, Renee, and Desmond, the 3 of them arranged with the slightly overcomposed posture of people who have rehearsed their positions. Desmond opened by suggesting that the deed restriction, while technically recorded, might be challenged on grounds of Harold's mental capacity in 1991. He said this with professional smoothness, as though it were simply one legal avenue among several, nothing personal. Sandra slid a document across the table. Harold Calloway's 1991 medical records, she said, obtained with Mrs. Calloway's authorization. He was examined by his physician 6 weeks before the filing. Clean bill of health. No cognitive concerns noted. We anticipated this argument and prepared for it. Desmond looked at the document. His smoothness did not falter, but something shifted in his eyes. He reached for the papers with the unhurried deliberateness of a man buying time, reading what he already understood was going to be a problem. Beside him, Renee sat very still. Marcus looked at the table. Sandra then slid 2 more documents across. This is the false disclosure statement made to the escrow company regarding encumbrances on the property. And this is a transcript of your letter to my office, dated November 3rd, in which you characterized the power of attorney as a general durable POA authorizing real property transactions. It is not. The document speaks for itself. My concern is whether your characterization was an error or a deliberate misstatement. The room was very quiet. Desmond said, "This is an inappropriate characterization of a good faith legal—" "The North Carolina State Bar doesn't see it that way," Sandra said. "I've spoken with them informally. They are interested." Marcus, who had been silent through all of this, said suddenly, "This is insane. You can't threaten my wife's brother with a bar complaint just because—" "Marcus," Sandra said very calmly, "no one is threatening anyone. I'm informing you of existing facts and existing legal exposure. What you do with that information is your choice." Renee said, "Dorothy, I cannot believe you would do this to your own son." She said it to me directly, across the table, with the wounded voice she deployed so effectively. After everything you tried to do, I said, was sell my home without my consent. Silence. I had not planned to speak much in that room. I had intended to let Sandra carry it. But sitting across from the 3 of them, Marcus with his cold assessment, Renee with her manufactured grief, Desmond recalibrating furiously, something clarified in me completely, and I found I had something to say. Perhaps it was the weeks of carrying this quietly, the nights of watching the oak tree through the kitchen window, the long years of making Sunday dinners for a son who was measuring my square footage. Whatever it was, it had come to a point, and the point was now. "I have lived in that house for 41 years, I said. "I raised you in it, Marcus. Your father died loving it. I have no intention of leaving it, selling it, or sharing it with people who would have put me on the street. rather than start their married life honestly. You made a calculation about me, that I was old, that I was alone, that I loved you enough to absorb whatever you needed to take. You were wrong on the last count. I do love you, and loving you is not the same as being available for whatever you need to take. Renee started to speak. I held up one hand, and she stopped. I noticed she stopped. I think we all noticed. Sandra has prepared a settlement agreement, I said. You will sign a formal acknowledgement of the deed restriction's validity and your agreement not to challenge it in any future legal proceeding. Desmond will sign an acknowledgement that the POA was not applicable to real property transactions. In exchange, Sandra will not refer the escrow statement matter to the state bar or the district attorney's office. I paused. Those are the terms. They are not negotiable. The three of them looked at each other. Desmond leaned in and whispered something to Marcus. Marcus's jaw was tight. Renee was very still, and for the first time since I had met her, the stillness looked like someone realizing they had miscalculated badly and completely. She looked in that moment genuinely young, younger than I had ever seen her. Because real reckoning has a way of stripping away the performance of confidence and leaving what's actually there underneath. 20 minutes later, they signed. The drive home from Sandra's office that afternoon was one of the quietest, most complete moments I can remember. Asheville in late November is gray and still, the mountains sitting low in the clouds, the streets mostly empty in the mid-afternoon. I drove slowly, as I always did on the mountain roads, and I was aware of a sensation I couldn't immediately name, something light and spacious, like a room that has been opened after a long time closed. It took me until I turned onto Birchwood Lane to understand what it was. Relief. Not triumph exactly. Relief. The particular relief of a thing that has been held in tension for a very long time, finally released. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The rose bushes along the front fence were bare now, the way they always were in November, just dark canes and a few dried hips holding on. But I knew what they would look like in May. I had always known what they would look like in May, and for a few months I hadn't been entirely certain I would still be here to see it. That certainty was back now, settled and solid, and I held it for a moment, the way you hold something you have almost lost. Sandra called that evening to confirm that the signed settlement documents had been properly notarized and filed with the county clerk. The acknowledgement of the deed restriction's validity was now part of the public record, which meant that any future attempt by Marcus or any party acting on his behalf to challenge it would be starting from a position of documented bad faith. It was, Sandra said, as clean a resolution as she had seen in a contested property matter. You prepared well, she told me. Harold prepared better. I laughed at that. He always did. The buyer, the one who had withdrawn from the transaction, was a young couple, a teacher and a physical therapist, Sandra had mentioned at some point, who had spent 6 weeks with the house already in their minds, planning. I felt something for them, genuinely, some sympathy for a disappointment they hadn't deserved. They'd had nothing to do with Marcus's scheming and had lost months because of it. I hoped they found something just as good. I hoped the teacher had a backyard, and that they planted something in it, and that it bloomed. Over the following weeks, I watched the legal aftermath settle. Desmond's acknowledgement regarding the power of attorney went into his file at the state bar. Not as a complaint, as agreed, but Sandra had been clear with me that if he ever came near a property matter he wasn't qualified to handle again, the prior acknowledgement would be available. Whether that functioned as a deterrent, I couldn't say, but Sandra seemed satisfied. I trusted her judgment. She had earned it. What struck me most in those quiet weeks after the mediation was not the legal victory, but the stillness it produced in me. I had expected to feel more anger, more grief, more of the complicated sorrow that had moved through me in waves since October. Instead, I felt something simpler, clear, like a window that has been cleaned after a long winter. The more significant consequence was financial. Marcus had, in anticipation of the sale proceeds, made several significant commitments: a down payment on a property in Charlotte, deposits on what sounded like a fairly ambitious wedding, and what Connie had heard from a mutual acquaintance was described as a business venture of the kind Marcus had always favored. High concept, undercapitalized, and built almost entirely on money he didn't yet have. When the $800,000 didn't materialize, all of those commitments collapsed in sequence, the way things do when they're built on a single foundation. It was not a slow unraveling. It was quick, the way a house of cards goes. One card, and then all of them at once. I did not feel satisfaction at this. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated. A grief underneath the relief. A mourning for the version of my son who might have existed if different choices had been made, by him and perhaps by me over the years. What had I missed when he was young? What signals had I given that told him the world owed him what he hadn't earned? These were not questions with clean answers, and I did not pretend they were. Parenting is a long act of hope, and sometimes hope is what gets you into trouble, because it makes you willing to overlook things you should see clearly. Patricia came back for Thanksgiving that year, just the two of us, which was how it had often been since Harold's death. She brought sweet potato pie from a bakery in Denver she'd discovered and pretended she'd made it herself, which we both knew was a lie, and which I appreciated enormously for the love behind it. We sat on the porch after dinner, wrapped in blankets, watching the oak tree in the backyard hold its bare arms up to the cold sky, and she said, "You know, Dad knew about Marcus. He knew decades before we were willing to say it." "He did," I said. "That restriction wasn't just practical. It was him protecting you from having to choose." I thought about that for a long time. The oak tree was very still. The neighborhood was quiet, the way Asheville gets on Thanksgiving evening when everyone is inside and warm, and the streets belong to nobody. "No," I said finally. He knew I'd have to choose eventually. He just made sure the choice was possible to make. Patricia nodded slowly, looking at the tree. She reached over and took my hand without saying anything, and we sat like that for a while, in the cold, in the quiet, in the house that was still and always mine. Spring came early that year, and I planted more roses. I had always meant to extend the garden along the south side of the house where the light was good, but for years there had been something. Harold's illness, then grief, then the accumulated inertia of living alone, that kept the plan from becoming action. That winter, after everything, I found myself impatient with inertia. On the first genuinely warm Saturday in March, Connie came over with gloves and a bottle of iced tea, and we spent 4 hours in the garden together, turning soil and talking. It was one of the best days I had had in years. The house, freed from the shadow of the past months, seemed different. I moved through it differently. I rearranged the living room the way I had wanted to for a decade. I had the back porch repaired. The boards had been soft for 2 winters. And on the first warm evening in April, I sat out there and watched the yard go golden in the evening light. Harold would have loved it. I also began volunteering with an elder law advocacy group in Asheville, connected loosely with Judith's former colleagues. It was work that felt useful in a specific way. helping older adults understand powers of attorney, property rights, the legal tools available when family relationships became complicated. I was not an attorney, and I never offered legal advice. But I could sit across from a frightened 75-year-old woman and say, from experience rather than theory, you have more options than you think. That turned out to be worth something. Patricia visited more frequently, not out of worry, but because things between us had grown closer in the wake of everything. She was seeing someone, a man named Frank, who taught history in Denver, and seemed to be exactly the kind of steady, decent person she had always deserved. I liked him from the first phone call, which is not always how these things go. As for Marcus and Renee, I heard things as you do in a life, through Connie and the small circuits of information that flow through every community. The business venture failed. The Charlotte property fell through. The wedding, planned at a level of extravagance the expected $800,000 would have barely covered, was reduced twice. Until it became something Renee described to anyone who would listen as intimate, and which others described differently. There were significant tensions in the marriage within the first year, which surprised no one who had seen how it was structured from the beginning, built on a shared project that had failed before the ceremony was over. I did not wish them suffering. I wished them something more complicated, the chance to become honestly themselves, which is sometimes the harder path and the better one. Marcus called me once, about 8 months after the mediation. He didn't apologize, not fully. He said he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. I said I was sorry too. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing much. The weather, the property market, a television show we had apparently both been watching. The most ordinary conversation we'd had in years. It was not reconciliation, not even the beginning of it, not yet. But it was a door left open by two people who had once loved each other without complication and might, with time and honesty, find their way back to something real. I left the door open, and I went back to my garden and my house and my life, which was, all things considered, a very good one. And to you, wherever you are, listening to this story, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Or would the weight of that love have been too much? Would you have found the document in the drawer, or would grief have hidden it from you? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think about your own house, your own papers, your own plans, share it with someone who might need to hear it. It might be the most useful thing you do today. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Dorothy's story. She's fine, by the way. The roses are blooming.